We need to talk about this Todd Blanche situation, right? Because you have Trump's nominee to be the next attorney general at his confirmation hearing today, and it's been something special.
How long do you intend to put up with that Kash Patel character? Are you good with his airplane jaunts? Are you confident he's not drinking on the job? Are you sure none of his travel is a pretext for vacation activities like snorkeling, Olympics, and visiting girlfriends? Are you sure he knows what he's doing? Do you vouch for him? Are you willing to look at whether he lied to this committee?
That's an extraordinarily obnoxious question.
Right, and Blanche, actually, he's been acting attorney general since Pam Bondi got the boot back in April, which honestly, for some reason, feels like 3 years ago. But actually, the day before this hearing, the New York Times publishing just this trove of Justice Department emails that gave some insight into Blanche's role at the DOJ. And you had it showing that he actually wrestled control over the so-called weaponization working group away from its former head, Ed Martin. Right, and that's the task force that, among other things, investigated the prosecutions of Jan 6 rioters and Biden's use of an autopen. And also, reportedly, Blanche's deputies were responsible for probing stuff like an FBI memo that targeted a conservative Catholic group in Richmond, prosecutions of anti-abortion activists, and federal scrutiny of conservative school board members. Actually, one really interesting one is that one team led by one of Blanche's aides reportedly focused on a single person, Tina Peters. That's a Colorado elections official that was convicted, imprisoned, and later released for election-related crimes. So basically, in Blanche's office appearing to be directly involved in many of the most high-profile efforts to rectify Trump's personal and political grievances. So when you had this hearing start today, one of the biggest issues was about the DOJ's independence from White House pressure. And actually, when he was asked whether he considers Donald Trump his friend, Blanche let out this awkward little Freudian slip.
I'm his lawyer, was his lawyer.
Right, and that's just one of the many reasons a lot of people have an issue with him, but also even his intentional comments didn't give more reason for confidence.
Is the Department of Justice that you're running independent from the White House?
The Department of Justice, like every single department in the executive, is part of the executive. I mean, Article 2 of the Constitution gives the power of the executive to President Trump. So we certainly operate with integrity. We certainly operate in the single mindset to serve the American people and do the right thing. But I am a member, if confirmed, I will be a member of the cabinet.
And then also when Blanche was given specific questions about what he would do for the president, he still gave these very dodgy, ambiguous answers.
Will you commit to following clear federal law and not deploying federal agents to polling locations?
I will commit to following the law, Senator, of course.
Does that include not deploying federal agents to polling places?
I will absolutely follow the law no matter what it includes, so yes.
Also, another point of contention that you had was the infamous anti-weaponization fund, which stemmed from Trump suing his own IRS for failing to protect his tax returns from getting leaked years ago, with the agency then settling. It was this very weird and what many considered corrupt I'm suing myself situation. And as part of that settlement, Trump, his family, and his businesses, they're shielded from any IRS audits or past tax returns. And then on top of that, you had the DOJ creating a $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund that critics really just called a slush fund for Trump's allies. And those allies included Jan 6 defendants. So you then also had a judge the other day ruling that both sides of the IRS case colluded to get this outcome, sanctioning Trump's lawyers and suggesting that Blanche should be disciplined as well. And for his part, Blanche in this hearing, he said, hey, that fund is dead, it's done, it's not moving forward. Basically, just forget about it. But then when Senator John Cornyn, he pointed out that, hey, the settlement's still on the table, regardless of whether the DOJ is acting on it right now, he seemed to admit that it could come back to life.
Is the settlement agreement enforceable as a contract by the parties?
Well, yes, it's an enforceable document. So I suppose if President Trump's counsel sought to enforce it, they potentially could. They could potentially say that, I suppose, that we breached by not moving forward. They haven't done that, and I'm not aware that they're planning on doing that. But even if we were litigating it, there's no fund. So the results of such litigation, whatever it would be, wouldn't be a revival of the fund.
Now, also a big thing with that is that fund connects to a larger question about Blanche's attitude towards January 6th. Because you have this guy, he keeps insisting, hey, the rule of law is the most important thing, but then you had Democrats hitting back with the obvious retort, well, what about the rioters?
How many people were convicted of assaulting law enforcement officers on January 6th?
I believe around 120 approximately, but I could be off a few more.
You are. The answer is more than 200. And how many of those individuals had their sentences commuted or were pardoned by President Trump?
President Trump either commuted or pardoned every defendant from the January 6 events.
So you saw him multiple times being asked, as Trump's top lawyer, how in the world can you defend this? And his answer kind of more or less was, I don't.
I have never said that any sort of violence against law enforcement is appropriate. I talk about what President Trump did. He has the absolute right to pardon anybody for any reason he sees fit. And every one of them got pardoned or commuted. I am not celebrating that. It is a fact.
Right, and if that feels like wishy-washy bullshit to you, you definitely aren't alone, because Senator Chris Coons, he hit him with his own quote from an interview that he gave during CPAC.
If you look at what happened to the men and women convicted because of January 6th, by 5 p.m. on January 20th, every one of them was either pardoned or had their sentence commuted, okay? So when folks say you've done nothing, I say you have a very short memory.
And so yeah, as Coons pointed out, that sure as fuck sounded like celebrating the pardons, but Blanche, yet I'm just doubling down.
I wasn't celebrating it. I was merely stating a fact, which is that the January 6th defendants did receive a very generous pardon or commutation from President Trump.
But then also another topic that Blanche kind of kept stumbling over was, of course, the Epstein files. Because you also had 10 victims actually showing up to the hearing, and they sat there the whole time staring Blanche right in the face. What you had were Democrats repeatedly pressing him on his department's bungling of the files, the way it redacted tons of embarrassing information and didn't redact some of the victims' names. And Blanche, he apologized, though. I will let you judge how sincere it was.
Any mistake that was made is not appropriate. And so, yes, I am sorry that in about 1% of the documents, mistakes were made. But what I will say on top of that is we put tons of resources to rectifying those mistakes immediately.
But even as you had him admitting in the passive voice that mistakes were made, he also pretended like Trump did not spend the better part of a year desperately flailing to keep the files from getting released. Right? In Blanche's retelling of history, Trump's DOJ, they wanted just so badly to release the files because it's the most transparent DOJ ever. They were just barred by law from releasing them, and we can actually thank Trump for signing the law that made them public. Even though now several of the Republicans that pushed to make those files getting released possible are no longer going to be in Congress, right, because they became personal enemies of Donald Trump. And even now, after the files are out, you have Blanche still not committing to personally meeting with the victims who were present and hearing their stories.
Chairman, I appreciate them being here today. I also have somebody from my office who's spent her entire career working on cases like Mr. Epstein's. She's available to talk to them.
Will you meet with these 10 survivors?
If they are represented by counsel, we will work with their counsel. If they don't have a lawyer, I will certainly make arrangements to make sure the right people at the Department of Justice meet with them.
Get it done?
Absolutely. I'm not allowed to meet with them directly, as you know.
But then later, you had Blanche seeming to contradict himself.
I never said I can't meet with them. I said if they were represented, I had to meet through counsel. But of course, I can meet with them. I'm the acting Attorney General of the United States, so yes, I can.
But then also, today was not just about Blanche, because you also had Jay Clayton having his confirmation hearing, and he's yet another Trump nominee who refused to admit that Joe Biden won the 2020 election. And that becomes especially concerning because the office that he might soon lead is responsible for, among many other important duties, identifying and countering foreign influence and interference in U.S. elections. Because Clayton is Trump's pick to replace Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence, who announced her resignation back in May. And while Trump, he actually first named Bill Pulte, a loyalist who has no national security experience and has launched mortgage fraud investigations against Trump's enemies as head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency as acting director, that immediately sparked pushback, and Trump announced that his permanent pick for the role would be Clayton. And as far as some of Clayton's background, after making millions of dollars working as a Wall Street attorney, he served as head of the Securities and Exchange Commission during the first Trump administration. He's also now serving as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And ultimately, he wasn't really seen as all that controversial of a figure, at least by the standards we kind of have come to expect under Trump. Because while, like Pulte, Clayton doesn't actually have any experience serving in any intelligence agency in any capacity. Not to mention, a few days before winning Trump's nomination, he publicly questioned the integrity of American elections.
We're doing an absolutely terrible job. And the American people are right to question it.
But still, despite the very obvious concerns, you had some lawmakers kind of eager to keep Pulte away from taking over entirely. In fact, so much so, they moved to suspend Senate rules to hold Clayton's confirmation hearing and secure a vote as quickly as possible. But then you had Trump abruptly delaying the confirmation proceedings, ordering Clayton not to appear at the initial hearing in an effort to force Congress to pass the SAVE Act, which is that voter ID bill that rights groups say would disenfranchise millions of Americans who don't have access to passports or can't easily access their birth certificates. Not to mention that it's kind of a big veiled effort to essentially kill mail-in voting. And that move led to Democrats pulling their support for a bill reauthorizing Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is another controversial program allowing intelligence agencies to carry out mass warrantless surveillance under certain conditions. But that delay, it also cleared the way for Pulte to take over as acting director. And just in his short time in that role, he already fired some intelligence officials while also working on the declassification and potential release of documents related to election security or interference. With that, tomorrow night, he's expected to appear alongside Trump for that televised address we talked about earlier, where he's expected to make claims about election election fraud, possibly focused around voting machines. And so now you've got Democrats, some of whom, they may have been willing to accept Clayton, wondering, is he going to be any different than Pulte? Especially since just last week, he also authorized subpoenas for a group of New York Times reporters who reported on security issues relating to the new version of Air Force One that was gifted to Trump by the Qatari government. And so what you had were a number of Democratic senators pouncing on that today, with Ron Wyden of Oregon, for example, asking Clayton who directed him to issue those subpoenas. But Clayton, he mostly sidestepped the question, saying that he signed them in connection with an ongoing national security investigation, and added,
I am absolutely committed to and respect our First Amendment and the role of the press.
Right, but the election issue, it really came to dominate the hearing as Clayton time and time again danced around, with just one simple question.
Do you deny that Joe Biden won the 2020 election?
But then Clayton notably added,
We have substantial work to do, and I've made it in improving our electoral processes. It's part of national security. And I feel strongly about that.
An answer that ended up not inspiring a lot of confidence. And so then you had Angus King, an independent from Maine, really laying into Clayton.
Who won the 2020 election?
I've answered that question. I'm not going to get into that.
You have not
anymore.
answered that question. Could you answer the question? Who won the 2020 election? Pretty simple question. I'm just
worked
asking
hard
a
for the
really
transition.
simple question. Who won the 2020 election?
As I said to you, we went through our processes, and Joe Biden became the president of the United States. I'm here to talk about my qualifications.
One of your qualifications is you told us you're going to tell the truth to power, and you won't answer a very simple question.
I think I've answered it many times.
You have not answered it.
Right, and with all that, probably I would say the closest he came to answering was with Arizona Senator Mark Kelly when he acknowledged that Biden had the most electoral votes. But still, he just wouldn't say Biden won. And so you had Kelly arguing at this show that Clayton, he doesn't have what it takes for this job.
You're going to be in a room with him many times. And at times, you should have a difference of opinion. And if you can't disagree with him when he's not in the room, are you going to be able to disagree with him when you're sitting across from him in the Oval Office or the Situation Room?
And then finally, you had John Ossoff going through the motions as well, grilling Clayton about the 2020 election and slamming him for his response. And so with all this, if next week all 8 Democrats oppose his nomination, then he's going to need unanimous support from the panel's 9 Republicans, and then there's going to be a full vote in the Senate. But of course, in the meantime, you still have Acting Director Bill Pulte already hard at work exploiting the office to do Trump's bidding. And that speech tomorrow, it's going to be something we have to keep our eyes on, because it's not just possibly Trump being a sore loser again. If he does hit on this, if the reporting is true, this is laying the groundwork to challenge any future results that he does not like. And Clayton, he said very little to suggest that he would actually stand in the way.